If you, like me, want nothing more in the world than to do this work,
you know, knowing what I know today about journalism today, I would make the plunge. I mean, it's so hard.
Do you wish you would have done something else?
No, I think probably I would do it again.
Yeah?
Where do you get your news? Do you know who or what writes it? Do you trust the news? Almost everything about journalism, even in the short 30 years that I've been in the business, has changed. The concern, however, is that it has not changed for the better. 앤마리리핀스키 is a veteran journalist and a vocal advocate for the need to protect free press and quality journalism if we are to protect democracy. On this episode, our globalist is 앤마리리핀스키, the curator for the Nieman Foundation for Journalism, who is a former editor of the Chicago Tribune and recipient of the Pulitzer Prize.
Some years ago, following the death of my beloved maternal grandmother, I spent an afternoon reading her diaries. Great news from Helen. Anne-Marie called. She won a Pulitzer Prize. Whither goes journalism is how goes democracy. And when you see challenges to what happens to the press, you're going to see a faltering or even failing democracy in a country. The company to make such a commitment, Mangay and all of her colleagues there, where journalism has become more valued as a pillar of democracy and not dismissed as
Welcome, Ms. Lipinski, or Anne-Marie, to the Globalists.
GA, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be with you today.
First off, when you were at the Chicago Tribune, you won a Pulitzer for investigative journalism, but you also served on the board and to decide who gets a Pulitzer Prize. How do you really get to select? I mean, there's so many stories about so many things around the world. What is that process like?
It's a lengthy process that involves a lot of people. By the time it...
a lot of arguments?
Yeah, but the best arguments. It was like the world's best book club. I loved being a part of the board. Stories come to you to read or to see or to listen to that you didn't see because they're coming from parts of the country where you're not paying attention to what's happening in that city or that state. So it's this really rich process that choosing prize winners, it's not a science. You're using your own knowledge, but also your own tastes. And those tastes can be flawed, but on the mix of a board, you're getting lots of diverse opinions. And the arguments are respectful, intense. And do we get it right? Do we get it wrong? I'm not sure there is a right and a wrong, but what I do know is that it's worth the conversation. And it's worth saying to the nation once a year, here's some work in each of these areas that we want you to see as a country, that we want you to talk about. We want you to read them, we want you to watch them, we want you to listen to them, and hopefully it makes us better as a people. I loved the work.
Yeah. I mean, it does really give you an essence of what we want to achieve, what we should be looking for. The talk that you recently gave had a very provocative title. It was, "We will not save democracy without saving journalism." So what did you mean?
So democracy in general is on the ropes. We're in trouble around the world. And journalists and journalism have come in for a lot of criticism in recent years. More than usual, journalists have always been criticized, but there's been this increase in the kind of real hostility that I think we haven't seen in a long time, if ever, certainly in the United States. And this use of the term, fake news to denigrate not individuals or certain stories, but the profession as a whole. And what we know historically, and what we still know today, is the work of journalism in providing voters, readers, a republic with the news and information they need to know to make independent decisions about their lives, about their leaders, about their futures. The work of journalists to nourish that process in a democracy is fundamental. It just is fundamental. It's not sort of nice to have, it's necessary to have. And so that's what I mean by that. There really is not a robust or healthy democracy without that constant, what President Kennedy used to call abrasive quality of the press, rubbing up against the government, keeping the government honest, looking out for corruption, researching on behalf of the people, on behalf of a public.
I mean, hearing you talk, you seem to be almost describing the journalism scene in Korea today. When you look at Korea, is there something that sort of jumps out at you in terms of the state of journalism in this country?
The rise of the internet has been both a miraculous story. We have access to far more news and information than we've ever had in human history, and that's a beautiful thing. On the other hand, it has also been a tool of a lot of ill. And I think Korea, which has a very robust relationship with the internet, Korea is or certainly one of the greatest consumers of internet information in the world. So there's a lot of reliance on that, which is great, but I think we have not educated people, and journalists have not yet entirely learned how to harness the internet in ways that, again, will feed people with information that is accurate and reliable. And so into that breach rushed a lot of bad actors, and I don't think our education systems have kept pace with the internet. Are we teaching our children, are we teaching new generations of information consumers how to separate the wheat from the chaff, how to make sure that they're getting the information they need to continue to live in a democracy?
Well, my students ask me that all the time, and I find it difficult to answer. How do you, to separate? How do you protect yourself from news that is there to do you harm versus, actual factual news that you can trust? But trust is a
Big word.
is a big word in journalism. The lack of trust in journalism and journalists as a whole, we're pretty low on the list as well. What kind of problem does that? That's a problem for not just journalism, but as you said, democracy as a whole.
Yes, it's a huge problem. And I do hear a lot of journalists in Korea talking about that. And I think it's an extension of declining trust across all institutions. You're seeing it played out in the Itaewon story. Day after day after day, the coverage I'm reading is about failures at various levels. And this idea, this question, whose fault is it, right? So there's this general lack of trust, I think, across institutions. The media is an institution, right? We are an institution. So restoring that trust is not easy because some of it we control, some of it we don't, right? So bridging that is really, really, really complex, especially in a city this size, in a country this size. It's not an easy matter, and there is not a quick fix to this. And we've talked about some of these long-term, these trade-offs you make, immediacy versus establishing a relationship that produces a better story. Those trade-offs are going to feed how people feel about this trust issue, and we just have to be mindful of that.
The very platforms in social media that deliver the facts to you are biased against facts. They're biased against journalists. They are, by design, dividing us and radicalizing us.
Our common friend, Maria Ressa,
Yes.
who is a Nobel Peace
Yes.
Prize winner.
Aren't we proud of her?
We are very proud. And the very fact that they gave a Peace Prize to journalists, I think, is also
Yes.
a very significant move. But she points out that social media is really one of the biggest culprits to this, all these problems associated with journalism and media. Increasingly, social media like Facebook and Twitter are playing a role in the area of journalism. What do you see? How do you see that impacting journalism and democracy?
The impact of this is real. It's deadly. In the case of Jamal, literally deadly. But in the case of democracy, a different kind of death occurs. So this, if we cannot, as a community, in any community, agree to a basic set of facts, we may not like them, but if we cannot agree to them, and one of the reasons we can't agree to them is because all the leaders around us are disagreeing about them, and that people are using their very impressive skill to undermine our belief in these facts, to tell us night is day and right is wrong. When that happens, what do we have? Like, what do we have as a community? And so it's not just our ability to discuss or debate, it's the absolute disagreement over the fundamental building blocks of any conversation we want to have about the biggest issues of the day. And so that's, I think, part of what Maria decries. It's certainly what I decry and what any journalist would. But it's been elevated to an art form, and social media have offered these tools. Before social media, we used to have these debates and they looked a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
Now with social media, the speed and efficacy with which a lie is communicated is breathtaking and frightening.
And are we to see events and developments like, big corporation heads like Elon Musk taking over social media platforms to further their interests?
Twitter has become a very, in many countries, a very important social media forum for a lot of conversation and a lot of communication about just basic information. And one of the things that destabilized Twitter during the Trump campaign was a lying president who consistently was using the platform to intentionally misinform the nation and to tell the big lie consistently. And so Twitter took what I thought was a rightful and some people thought courageous, but it was the right thing to do, to say, we're not going to traffic in that. We know this is a lie. We're not going to allow this on that on our platform. It's the kind of thing that you were used to doing in a newsroom, that I was used to doing in a newsroom. And the fact that those values don't instantly apply to social media sites is the difference between these legacy newsrooms and those institutions. I don't know what Mr. Musk plans around that basic issue, where people are trafficking in the worst sorts of efforts to destabilize and to misinform the public. We need to know what that's going to look like under his leadership, and we don't yet. But you know what? Let's give him the chance to do the right thing. That would be lovely.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Tragically, a number of people died on the way.
There's some very high waves crashing behind me, as you can see.
Korea, we just went through our own horrific incident in Itaewon. In disaster reporting, I mean, what makes good journalism in disaster reporting?
You know, that's such a good question. And first of all, what a traumatic experience Seoul and the nation have been through, and heartbreaking to read about. And so my deepest condolences to everybody who has been witness to that, who has suffered through that. And I have been so grateful for the reporting on it, which has informed me about a community I didn't know much about, and certainly have allowed the victims to live in my mind through the stories that have been written. The part that I think has really changed in recent years is how we think about what we now call trauma-centered reporting, where you and I have probably both done stories in our career where our job was to sort of get the family reaction before anybody else did. And that's obviously, being quick with the news is important. But I think these notions about trauma and how you can traumatize people or re-traumatize people in the course of doing this work have become much more prominent. Tactics you should use, tactics you shouldn't use, and just how you talk to somebody who's been through the worst experience of their lives. Some of the survivors in this case.
Covering those kind of horrific incidents, really, those are the times I felt like I don't want to be in this business.
Exactly, and I think every journalist has had that feeling. I do think since you and I were doing that kind of work, the other thing that's changed, something we do at Nieman now that didn't used to happen when I was a Nieman Fellow, is we do trauma training for the journalists, a lot of whom come to their fellowship having covered and witnessed some of the worst things humanity can do, right? And so they're coming. I have journalists there right now from Ukraine and from Russia who've just been through a very bad experience, whose countries continue to go through traumatic experiences, and helping journalists like that process their own experiences, but also learn how to cover these very traumatic moments for their neighbors, for their communities, for their countries, is something we just used to assume, right? It was just like, just go do it. And now I think we're doing a much better job at training people on how to do that.
I'm sure it's a very comprehensive and complicated process, but if you were to take maybe one essence, what is it that the journalists need to keep in mind when covering traumatic events?
I think what you have to do is understand that you are trying to gather information, but you're also allowing people the opportunity to tell a story that may be the most important story they ever lived through in their lives. And I don't mean newspaper story or television story, a personal story. And that you are going to be a compassionate listener. And that you're not going to say things like, I know just how you feel, because you do not. You know, so these kind of pat phrases that you sometimes hear, I know what you're going through. You do not. You're there to learn what someone's going through. You're there to learn about this experience. But they're the expert. You are not. And so to give people this, to create this space and this time to respectfully ask questions about this trauma, and I'm speaking very specifically of, say, families now, right? Who knows how long it's going to take them to process this horror. That kind of respect, and not the, I'm on deadline, you know, can you please? So we just have to build that into our process.
You're very right about the kind of phrases not to be used. But I think, not always, but some of the reasons that they do it is they are on deadline, that they need to get an answer out right away, and an answer that is better than their competitor and will make the headline. And so I think it is sort of journalists on the pressure, competing with so many other outlets. And that makes it even more difficult.
I do think, though, and I'm sure you've had this experience, I have done stories in my career, sometimes where I was first, but sometimes where I wasn't, but I was better. And, you know, we did a story once in the Tribune. It was a story about a Rottweiler dog that had attacked a child in a neighborhood and just torn this neighborhood apart, and people taking sides between these families, et cetera. Our reporters really wanted to talk to the family whose child had been victimized. And no, this family wasn't talking to anybody. And the reporters were showing up at their front porch, calling them. My reporter sat down and she wrote a letter, a handwritten letter, and she dropped the letter at the home and she waited. The story that that reporter eventually got was remarkable. The trust she built in that moment by making the choice that she made allowed her to do a story that no one else was able to do. And I think we just have to think about, and it goes to the credibility questions you were asking earlier. We need our community to think of us in a credible way and in a compassionate way, especially around these stories. And I think we have to make choices that are investments in the long-term relationship with our communities.
Knowing what you know today and all the concerns as well as the possibilities of journalism, what would you say to a young student who aspires to be a journalist? Should they maybe pick another career? I mean, what would you say to them?
So I think if you only aspire to it, maybe find something else to do, maybe not. If you, like me, want nothing more in the world than to do this work, then however hard it is, let's figure it out for you. Because this work is so important. It's so necessary. We need good practitioners. We need better and better journalists. And as hard as it is, as challenging as it is, there can still be a phenomenally rewarding career for people in it. And so if somebody comes to me and says, oh, I'm kind of thinking about journalism, you better be more than just thinking about it. Do you really want this? And that's probably true of other careers too, but it is challenging and it can be too hard if just kind of wanting it or just thinking about it is all you feel. But I'm sure you felt this way at an early point in your career. I didn't want to do anything else. Journalism was the love of my life. And so there were challenges then. The challenges are different and I think bigger now. But people are still making it work. And if anyone, by the way, is listening to this and feels that way, you know, send me an email. I am happy to talk to you about this. We need you.
I know. I'm not really sure if I, knowing what I know today about journalism today, I would make the plunge. It's so hard.
Do you wish you would have done something else?
No, I think probably I would do it again.
Yeah.
But today, I'm not sure I would have come out the same. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like a different animal.
It's
journalism.
different, but that doesn't make it any less worthwhile. You know, again, those sort of central fundamental skills and goals we were talking about, they're still so important. So if you care about the world, if you care about your community, if you care about democracy, like pick a thing you care about. If you do and you think journalism can help make that better, it's an amazing way to spend your life.
That is true. And on that very hopeful note, thank you for joining us this week on The Globalist.
Thank you.
And for me, that's it for this week. I'll be back next week with another globalist who helped put Korea on the map. Sun Jie out.